Verses leading up to today's reading relate how the angel Gabriel came to old Zechariah in the temple, telling him that Elizabeth would conceive even though she was old, and the baby would be called John, which makes Andy's story today have an impact. Gabriel then took away Zechariah's ability to speak until after the baby was born. And now, Luke chapter 1, verses 57 through 66. Now the time came for Elizabeth to give birth, and she bore a son. Her neighbors and relatives heard that the Lord had shown his great mercy to her, and they rejoiced with her. On the 8th day, they came to circumcise the child, and they were going to name him Zechariah after his father. But his mother said, "No, he is to be called John." They said to her, "None of your relatives has this name." Then they began motioning to his father to find out what name he wanted to give them. He asked for a writing tablet and wrote, "His name is John." All of them were amazed. Immediately his mouth was opened and his tongue freed, and he began to speak, praising God. Fear came over all their neighbors, and all these things were talked about throughout the entire hill country of Judea. And all who heard them pondered them and said, "What then will this child become? For indeed, the hand of the Lord was with him." Words of God.
I remember when Chloe was born, our first child. We lived in Memphis. As you might expect, the pains began at a convenient time, about 2 o'clock one Sunday morning. We called the midwife. She showed up at our house. It's time. So, off to the hospital we went. Were we afraid? Of course. We were 22 and 23 years young and had no idea what we were doing. But our fear wasn't alone. We also had joy. And when the baby came, we were overwhelmed with her presence. Friends came to see her, nearly as excited as we were. Lynn's parents rushed in from Dyer, Tennessee, to help us adjust to having a new creature in the household. Members of the youth group couldn't wait to get their hands on her that we were serving at the time. "What's her name?" they asked. "Chloe," we said. They replied. They were unsure of our choice, but we didn't care. We got to choose, and we chose Chloe Ann with the E at the end of the Ann. Thank you very much. We were way too young to have children. Zechariah and Elizabeth had the opposite problem. They were way too old. They wanted children, just didn't have any. Folks probably wondered if Elizabeth had done something wrong. No one in ancient Israel understood how the biology worked, so they assumed always that the woman must be the problem. The question on their minds was, what did Elizabeth do to deserve this? Most of them had probably good sense not to ask that question out loud, but the idea was there. She must have failed somehow, or she wouldn't be cursed in this way. Luke's gospel makes it clear, however, that Elizabeth and Zechariah were not to blame. Both she and her husband were from clergy families. They went to temple regularly, kept all the rituals, lived upright lives, which is not to say that they were better than anybody else, but at least they were no worse than lots of other people living in the area who had children galore. God had not judged this couple for some unseen sin. They just couldn't have babies. And finally they got too old. But watch out. God is on the prowl in the first 2 chapters of Luke, and you know what they say about God. With God, anything is possible. And so Elizabeth woke one morning and decided she was going to have crackers for breakfast. She was feeling just a little queasy. A few weeks later, she knows she was putting on a few pounds. Wonder how that happened. Her eating habits hadn't changed really. No, it couldn't be. And then that unmistakable turning in her own body that she could not deny. A life living within her life. After all those years of hoping and praying and then giving up, the promise of a baby. All the shame and guilt went out with her tears, and all the joy filled its place. Also, the whole community was full of joy. As is always the case, it's not just about us when a baby's born, it's about the whole community. The surrounding hillsides of Judea were ripe with the news, good news of great joy. Neighbors and relatives brought gifts of food by to the old couple and left with smiles on their faces, shaking their heads. This unexpected birth to a barren couple stirred everybody. You know what it made them think? It made them think, maybe God is here after all. You wonder sometimes after what seems like a long, dry season. Maybe God is in the hill country of Judea and has not abandoned us. Maybe God can work wonders right here. When God is working wonders, you see, it's not just babies that are born, but hope and joy in everyone's heart. This crowd around Elizabeth and Zechariah was so happy that they decided that they would go to the temple in Jerusalem on the 8th day for the baby's circumcision. That was the practice of the time, have the male baby circumcised on the 8th day, and that's roughly equivalent to baptism in ancient Israel. And they, had this question on their mind they'd been putting off to ask Elizabeth. What is the baby's name going to be? Believe it or not, they already had their ideas of what the baby's name ought to be. We'll name him Zechariah after his father, as if it was their job. Well, she said, the baby's name is John. They said. Nobody else in the family has that name. So they went to the daddy and began to use sign language to ask his opinion. They had to use gestures, as Wes told you, because one day, around 9 months earlier, Zechariah was serving as high priest in the temple. Or not high priest, but as priest in that Holy of Holies, that place where a priest only goes once a year to make sacrifice for the sins of the people. And while he was in there, the angel Gabriel appeared in that inner sanctum to tell him about Elizabeth's good fortune. Nobody outside knew that. Zechariah himself was skeptical of the angel's promise, and he said, "Can you give me a sign?" Which made Gabriel very mad. Gabriel said, "Am I not sign enough? Here's your sign. You won't be able to talk." And the Greek says, talk or speak, until the baby is born. So, he got his sign. And by the way, Gabriel said, name the baby John. And that's what Zechariah did. When the crowd who had come with him for the circumcision didn't believe Elizabeth and asked for the child's name, he said, "Give me something or motion for something to write with," and told them, "John is his name, with an H, as my lovely wife said." And immediately, he began to talk again. Now at this point, fear got hold of the people. Not the kind of fear that diminishes life or paralyzes life, but the kind that comes with knowing that God is real and present and who knows what's going to happen next. Reverence, we call it. Born of awe, because God is close and who knows what God will do next. Let's go through the list again of all the wonders in this story. A baby born to a couple way too old to be having babies. A wife and a husband who somehow know the name of this baby, even though they can't communicate with one another. And then a once deaf and mute man, who everyone assumes has had a stroke, is dancing and singing and praising God again, giving God a big shout out. Something special was happening, the people thought. We better be on our tippy toes, eyes wide open. Reverence. And then they looked at the baby and said, man, God's hands on this child. What will become of this child? So Luke gives us two Christmas babies. One born to someone too young, Mary, another born to a couple too old. But both babies are wonders of God's love. You can think about it this way. The birth of Christ was like a sonic boom in history. The ripples ever widening forward into the future, but also backward into the past, so that the people of Judea felt the coming of Christ even before He got there. It's true that shepherds looked over the manger and said, "Oh, God is with us." But the coming of John had people wondering the same thing. Months before Christ, another baby had them asking, "Oh, is God with us? Doing something fresh and saving?" And the answer was yes. This couple's baby was a sign that God was with them before God was with them in Jesus. Now, I believe the old creeds of the church, but they claim Jesus was unique. He was so close to God, He was God, fully human, in all aspects like us except for sinfulness. We can do no better than Jesus, in other words. If we want to know who God is, we look at Him, we watch His life and the way He died. We know who God is through Jesus. He was special and can't be replaced. I believe that. But friends, is it not also true that every new child is a little bit of God with us? God save us from ever worshiping our children. They can't bear it and don't ask for it. But doesn't God often come to us with saving power in small bundles of human flesh? Our lives were never the same after our first child. She stretched us to the limits. We became better people. She called forth from us more goodness than we knew we had, and sometimes she made demands of us we were not sure that we could fill, but we did. Because of that nursery that was down the hall in the house, new dreams and hopes were alive in our home. And while we learned the hard agony of guarding one of our own, we also experienced joy previously unknown. And all this redemptive change, all of it, from 8 pounds of human tissue that couldn't even speak its name. God was with us, turning our world upside down. Oh, those tiny babies, it's true, they all grow up and they all break our hearts. A little bit, sometimes a lot. But not before they pronounce their blessing. God's blessing over our lives. And now, we've baptized Noah. His namesake, a righteous man who built a saving ark that carried God's people onto a new day. What will become of Noah, this child? We don't ask those questions by wringing our hands. We ask them out of hope. What will he be and do? Only God knows. But God makes this kind of promise. I know my plans for you, says the Lord, from the book of Jeremiah. They are plans for good and not for evil, to give you a future and a hope. What will become of this child? We ask in awe, in joy, and we stand on our tippy toes to find out. And of course, we got to do our part, church. Do we have spaces? Do we have plans to safeguard our children where they're with us so that they'll know they're safe here and the people around them can be trusted? Yes, we do. Do we have classes on Sunday mornings and other times that will teach them the faith so that they can grow into maturity? Yes, we do. When the time is right, will we lead them through a process so that they can profess their own faith and claim their baptism as their own? Yes. Will he, Noah, pick up from us how to love God and neighbor just by being around us in this community? Well, it's our job to make sure we're loving so he can catch the symptoms. We'll do our part, hoping and praying and bringing him to worship. And we'll also be open to what God can do to us through him. And also through the Cedillo children, three of whom were baptized yesterday. Roberto, Narciso, and Lily. Let's let these new children stretch us to the limits until we're better people. Let them call forth from us love we did not know we had. Let them deepen our own faith and joy until we're more church later than we are right now. These are the gifts that come when God entrusts little children to us. The miracle of new life, not only in our hands, but in us. Any baby can be a little God with us, a little Christmas right now. Remember Noah. Know that through him God can change us and make us more than we were before we knew him. That is good news and great joy.